Have you ever worked a job where you constantly looked over your shoulder, where every sound made your heart race? If you live in a city where danger feels too close to home, you'll understand exactly what Sophia Chun was going through that October evening. The dinner rush at Luna's diner hit like a freight train at 6:30, just as it did every Tuesday night. Sophia Chun moved between tables with practiced efficiency, her dark ponytail swinging as she balanced plates of meatloaf and mashed potatoes along her left arm while carrying a coffee pot in her right hand. At 24, she had learned to read a room the way other people read books, cataloging every face, every voice, every movement that might signal danger. The hypervigilance had become second nature over the past 8 months, ever since she had finally worked up the courage to leave Marcus. Even now, surrounded by the familiar chaos of clinking silverware and overlapping conversations, her shoulders remained tense, her eyes automatically scanning the entrance every few minutes. The therapist at the Women's Center had told her this constant state of alertness would fade with time, but Sophia wasn't convinced. Some wounds cut too deep to ever fully heal. She refilled coffee for the elderly couple in booth 3, their gentle chatter about grandchildren a soothing contrast to the anxiety that always hummed beneath her skin. Mrs. Patterson smiled up at her with genuine warmth, the kind of uncomplicated kindness Sophia had forgotten existed during those dark months with Marcus. These small moments of normalcy were what kept her going, proof that she had made the right choice in leaving, even when the fear threatened to overwhelm her. The bell above the door chimed, and Sophia glanced up automatically, her body already tensing before her brain had time to process who had entered. In the corner booth by the window, she noticed him watching her again. Dante Marcelli. He came in 3 times a week, always ordered the same thing, always left a generous tip, and always seemed to be observing everything with those dark, intelligent eyes that missed nothing. There was something about him that set him apart from the usual crowd at Luna's. His clothes were expensive, his dark hair styled with the kind of precision that spoke of regular visits to high-end salons, and he carried himself with a quiet confidence that suggested he was accustomed to being in control. He looked to be in his early 30s, tall and broad-shouldered, with olive skin and a face that would have been classically handsome if not for the slight crookedness in his nose that suggested it had been broken at least once. Sophia had served him dozens of times over the past few months, but their interactions remained professionally polite. He never lingered in conversation, never made her feel uncomfortable the way some customers did, but she was acutely aware of his presence whenever he was there. Tonight, as she approached his table with the coffee pot, she caught him studying her with an intensity that made her pulse quicken. "Good evening," she said, forcing her voice to remain steady as she filled his cup. "The usual tonight?" Dante nodded, his gaze never leaving her face. "You look tired, Sophia. Double shift again?" The fact that he knew her schedule, that he had been paying enough attention to notice her exhaustion, should have alarmed her. Instead, she found herself oddly comforted by his concern. It had been so long since anyone had looked at her with genuine care rather than calculation or cruelty. "Rent doesn't pay itself," she replied with a weak smile, already turning toward the kitchen to place his order. Grilled chicken, steamed vegetables, no sauce, side of brown rice. She had memorized his preferences weeks ago. The evening continued its familiar rhythm. Sophia moved through her section with mechanical precision, her mind half focused on orders and refills while the other half remained vigilantly aware of her surroundings. The dinner crowd began to thin around 8:30, and she allowed herself to relax slightly as she wiped down empty tables and reset them for the next day. That was when the bell chimed again. Sophia looked up from the booth she was cleaning, and her entire world tilted sideways. Marcus stood in the doorway, his sandy brown hair disheveled, his pale blue eyes scanning the restaurant with the predatory intensity she remembered all too well. He looked exactly as he had 8 months ago, tall and lean with the kind of sharp features that had once seemed attractive, but now only reminded her of all the ways he had hurt her. Her body's response was immediate and devastating. Her hands began to shake so violently that the spray bottle of cleaning solution slipped from her grip and clattered to the floor. Her breath came in short, shallow gasps that made her feel lightheaded. Her legs felt weak, rooted to the spot beside the booth as if her muscles had simply forgotten how to move. This couldn't be happening. Not here, not at Luna's, the one place where she had finally begun to feel safe. Marcus wasn't supposed to know where she worked. She had been so careful, had changed her phone number, had moved across town to a neighborhood where none of their mutual friends lived. But somehow, he had found her anyway. Marcus's eyes locked onto hers across the restaurant, and his lips curved into the smile she had learned to fear. It wasn't an expression of happiness or affection. It was the smile of a hunter who had finally cornered his prey after a long and frustrating chase. He began walking toward her section with deliberate slowness, his hands shoved deep into the pockets of his worn leather jacket. Well, he said when he was close enough that only she could hear. Fancy seeing you here, sophomore. You've been a hard girl to track down. Sophia tried to speak, tried to tell him to leave, tried to scream for help, but her throat felt closed off, as if invisible hands were wrapped around her neck. The restaurant continued its normal rhythm around them, other customers oblivious to the drama unfolding in Booth 7. Her manager Tony was in the kitchen, her co-workers were busy with their own sections, and she was completely alone with the man who had made her life a living hell for 2 years. You look good, Marcus continued, his voice taking on that deceptively gentle tone that she knew preceded his worst moments. Really good. I've missed you, baby. We need to talk. The words seemed to come from very far away, muffled by the rushing sound in her ears that always accompanied her panic attacks. Sophia's vision began to tunnel, the edges of the restaurant fading to black as her body prepared to either fight or flee. But she couldn't do either. She was frozen, trapped in the amber of her own terror, while Marcus moved closer. That was when Dante appeared beside their booth. Sophia hadn't seen him approach, hadn't been aware of anything beyond her own spiraling panic and Marcus's threatening presence. But suddenly he was there, his tall frame blocking Marcus from getting any closer to her, his dark eyes cold and assessing as he looked at the situation. There a problem here? Dante asked, his voice quiet, but carrying an undertone of steel that made Marcus take an involuntary step backward. Marcus straightened, trying to regain his composure. No problem, man. Just catching up with my girl here. This is between me and her. So why don't you mind your own business? Dante's expression didn't change, but something shifted in his posture that made him seem suddenly more dangerous. Sophia couldn't see his face from her angle, but she watched Marcus's confident smirk falter as he took in whatever he saw in Dante's eyes. Sophia, Dante said without taking his gaze off Marcus. Are you all right? She tried to answer, tried to form words that would explain the situation, but her voice had abandoned her completely. All she could manage was a nearly imperceptible shake of her head. It was enough. I think there's been a misunderstanding, Dante said to Marcus, his tone remaining conversational despite the menace that radiated from him like heat. The lady doesn't seem interested in talking. Maybe it's time for you to leave. Listen here, Marcus started, his own voice rising as he tried to reassert his authority. I don't know who you think you are, but Sophia and I have history. She's my girlfriend, and we're going to work things out whether she wants to or not. The temperature in the restaurant seemed to drop 10 degrees. Dante stepped closer to Marcus, his movements controlled and deliberate. He was several inches taller than Marcus and considerably broader, but it was more than just physical size that made Marcus shrink back. There was something in Dante's presence that suggested violence was not only possible, but probable if the situation continued to escalate. Here's what's going to happen, Dante said, his voice barely above a whisper, but somehow more frightening than any shout could have been. You're going to walk outside and wait for me in the parking lot. I'll be out in exactly 2 minutes to have a conversation with you about appropriate behavior in establishments I care about. Do we understand each other? Marcus looked between Dante and Sophia, his face flushing red with embarrassment and anger. But whatever he saw in Dante's expression convinced him that arguing would be a mistake. After a moment that stretched like an eternity, he nodded curtly and stalked toward the exit, throwing one last venomous look at Sophia before disappearing through the door. The moment Marcus was gone, Sophia felt her legs give out. She sank into the booth she had been cleaning, her whole body shaking as the adrenaline finally hit her system. Dante slid into the seat across from her, his intimidating demeanor melting away as he focused on her obvious distress. Breathe, he said softly, his voice completely different now, warm and reassuring. In through your nose. Hold it for 4 counts. then out through your mouth. You're safe now, Sophia. He can't hurt you here. She followed his instructions, surprised by how much his calm presence helped to ground her. Slowly, her breathing began to return to normal, and the tunnel vision started to clear. When she finally looked up at him, she was struck by the genuine concern in his dark eyes. "Thank you," she whispered, her voice hoarse and shaky. "I don't know what would have happened if you hadn't." "You don't need to thank me," Dante replied. "And you don't need to explain anything right now. But I do need to ask you something important. Do you have somewhere safe to go tonight? Somewhere he doesn't know about?" Sophia's stomach dropped as the reality of her situation hit her. Marcus had found her at work, which meant he probably knew where she lived too. Her small studio apartment suddenly felt like a trap rather than a sanctuary, and she realized with growing panic that she had nowhere to run. I don't know," she admitted, fresh tears starting to fall. "If he found me here, he probably knows where I live. I don't have family nearby, and I can't ask my coworkers to get involved in this mess." Dante reached across the table and gently covered her shaking hand with his own. His skin was warm and surprisingly soft for someone who radiated such controlled power. "Then you'll come with me tonight," he said simply. "I have a secure place where you'll be safe while we figure out how to handle this situation permanently. No strings, no expectations. Just protection until we can make sure he won't be a problem anymore." The offer was simultaneously terrifying and tempting. Everything about Dante suggested he was not a man to be taken lightly, and accepting his help would mean placing herself under the protection of someone she barely knew. But as she thought about the alternative, about going back to her apartment and waiting for Marcus to show up in the middle of the night, the choice seemed obvious. "Why would you help me?" she asked, needing to understand his motivation before she made a decision that could change everything. Dante's expression softened, and for a moment she caught a glimpse of something vulnerable beneath his controlled exterior. "Because some fights are worth having," he said quietly, "and some people are worth protecting. You don't deserve to live in fear, Sophia. Let me help you in this." Dante squeezed her hand gently before standing from the booth, his movements fluid and controlled. "Wait here," he said quietly. "I'll be right back." Sophia watched him walk toward the exit, her heart hammering against her ribs as she realized what was about to happen in the parking lot. Part of her wanted to call out, to tell him not to go, that Marcus wasn't worth whatever consequences might follow. But a larger part of her, the part that had been living in constant fear for 8 months, felt a fierce surge of gratitude that someone was finally willing to stand between her and her nightmare. Through the window beside her booth, she could see the 2 men in the parking lot. Marcus stood beside his beat-up Honda Civic, his posture aggressive and defensive at the same time. Dante approached with the same controlled calm he had displayed inside the restaurant, his hands relaxed at his sides, but his entire bearing suggesting coiled power. They were too far away for her to hear what was being said, but she could see Marcus's face growing redder as Dante spoke in what appeared to be a conversational tone. The confrontation lasted less than 3 minutes. Sophia couldn't see exactly what happened, but Marcus suddenly stumbled backward against his car, his hand pressed to his stomach. Dante never appeared to raise his voice or make any sudden movements, but whatever he had done was effective. Marcus got into his car with jerky, panicked movements and drove away, so quickly his tires squealed against the asphalt. When Dante returned to the restaurant, his expression was calm and almost pleasant, as if he had simply stepped outside to check the weather. But Sophia noticed he took a moment to scan the dining room, his dark eyes cataloging every face and exit before he slid back into the booth across from her. Is he all right?" she asked, surprising herself with the question. After everything Marcus had put her through, she shouldn't care about his well-being. But the idea of violence being done on her behalf, even to protect her, made her stomach clench with complicated emotions. "He's fine," Dante replied, his tone matter-of-fact. "Bruised ego more than anything else. But he understands now that you're under my protection, and that coming anywhere near you again would be a serious mistake." The way he said protection, with such casual certainty, sent a shiver down Sophia's spine that had nothing to do with fear. There was something deeply appealing about the idea of someone powerful enough to make Marcus back down, choosing to use that power to keep her safe. It was a fantasy she had indulged in during the darkest moments of her relationship, when Marcus's control had felt absolute and escape had seemed impossible. But the rational part of her mind, the part that had learned to be suspicious of any man who seemed too good to be true, whispered warnings. She didn't know anything about Dante beyond his dinner preferences and his apparent ability to intimidate her abusive ex-boyfriend. For all she knew, she was trading one dangerous situation for another. Dante seemed to sense her internal conflict. "I know this is a lot to process," he said gently, "and I know you have no reason to trust me beyond what just happened here. But I meant what I said about keeping you safe. That man will be back, Sophia. Maybe not tonight, maybe not tomorrow, but he will be back. And next time, I might not be here to stop him." The truth of his words hit her like a physical blow. Marcus had never been the type to give up easily, especially when his ego was involved. If anything, being humiliated in public would only make him more determined to reassert his control over her. The temporary safety Dante had provided would last only as long as she remained in public spaces, surrounded by witnesses. "My apartment," she said quietly, the reality of her situation finally sinking in completely. "He knows where I live. I changed everything else, my phone number, my gym, even my grocery store. But I couldn't afford to break my lease and move again so soon after leaving him." Dante nodded as if he had expected this. "Then coming with me isn't really a choice, is it? It's a necessity." The drive to Dante's building passed in a blur of streetlights and nervous energy. Sophia sat in the passenger seat of his sleek black Mercedes, her hands folded tightly in her lap as she tried to process the surreal turn her evening had taken. Dante drove with the same controlled competence he did everything else, navigating the city traffic while occasionally glancing over to check on her well-being. She found herself studying his profile in the intermittent glow of passing lights, noting the strong line of his jaw and the way his dark hair fell across his forehead when he turned his head. There was something almost hypnotic about watching his hands on the steering wheel, long-fingered and steady, adorned with a simple gold signet ring that caught the light when he shifted gears. "You don't have to be afraid of me," he said suddenly, his voice cutting through her anxious thoughts. "I know this situation isn't ideal, and I know you're probably wondering what kind of man can make another man back down with just a conversation. But whatever you're thinking about me, I promise my intentions toward you are completely honorable." Sophia turned to study his face, looking for any sign of deception or hidden agenda. But all she saw was genuine concern and something that might have been loneliness. It occurred to her that despite his obvious wealth and power, there was something isolated about Dante Marcelli, as if he was accustomed to handling problems alone. "What do you do?" she asked, the question slipping out before she could stop herself. "For work, I mean. You're obviously successful, and you seem to be familiar with handling difficult situations." A smile ghosted across Dante's lips, but it didn't quite reach his eyes. "I'm in the protection business," he said after a moment. "I help people who can't help themselves, and I make sure that certain neighborhoods remain safe for the people who live and work there." It wasn't a complete answer, and they both knew it. But Sophia found herself oddly reassured by his honesty about not being entirely honest. At least he wasn't trying to sell her an elaborate lie about being a legitimate businessman. The building Dante led her to was everything she had expected and more. 40 stories of glass and steel rising into the night sky, with a uniformed doorman and the kind of marble lobby that probably cost more than she made in a year. Sophia felt acutely aware of her wrinkled work uniform and the smell of coffee and French fries that clung to her clothes as they rode the elevator to the 38th floor. Dante's penthouse was a study in understated elegance, all clean lines and expensive furniture arranged to take advantage of the spectacular city view. Floor-to-ceiling windows dominated 2 walls, offering a panoramic vista of lights stretching to the horizon. The space was immaculate but somehow sterile, as if it were more of a showcase than a home. "This is beautiful," Sophia said, her voice barely above a whisper as she took in the scope of the apartment. But it was intimidating too, a reminder of the vast gulf between her world and his. Dante moved to a wet bar in the corner and began preparing something. "You're in shock," he observed, his tone clinical but kind. "Your body has been running on adrenaline for the past hour, and now that the immediate threat is gone, you're going to crash. When's the last time you ate something?" Sophia tried to remember, but the events of the evening had scrambled her sense of time. "Lunch, maybe? I had a granola bar during my break around 3. He shook his head disapprovingly and moved to the kitchen, which was a masterpiece of stainless steel and black granite that looked like it belonged in a high-end restaurant. "Sit," he instructed, pointing to one of the bar stools at the kitchen island. "I'm going to make you something to eat and some tea that will help with the anxiety." Watching Dante cook was a revelation. His movements in the kitchen were as controlled and efficient as everything else about him. But there was something almost meditative about the way he prepared a simple meal of scrambled eggs and toast. He moved like someone who had spent considerable time learning to take care of himself and possibly others. The tea he placed in front of her was fragrant with chamomile and something else she couldn't identify. Whatever it was, it worked. With each sip, she felt some of the crushing tension leave her shoulders, and her hands finally stopped shaking. "Tell me about him," Dante said as he set a plate of food before her. "How long were you together? When did the problem start?" Sophia took a small bite of eggs, surprised to discover how hungry she actually was. 2 years together," she said quietly. "The problem started almost immediately, but they were small at first. He didn't like my friends, thought they were a bad influence. Then he didn't want me going out without him. Then he started getting angry when other men looked at me, even completely innocent interactions with coworkers or customers." Dante listened without interruption, his dark eyes focused entirely on her face as she spoke. There was no judgment in his expression, no impatience or disbelief. Just careful attention and growing anger that he kept tightly controlled. "It escalated gradually," she continued, the words coming easier now that she had started. "Emotional abuse first, making me feel like everything was my fault, like I was crazy for being upset by his behavior. Then he started grabbing me when he was angry, just hard enough to bruise, but not hard enough to leave marks that would show. By the time it got really bad, I was so isolated and beaten down that I believed him when he said no one would help me if I left." "How did you finally get away?" Dante asked, his voice carefully neutral despite the fury she could see building behind his eyes. "My sister came to visit unexpectedly," Sophia said, managing a small smile at the memory. "She saw right through his act immediately, and when she saw the finger-shaped bruises on my arms, she refused to leave without me. She helped me pack while he was at work and drove me to a women's shelter 3 states away. I stayed there for 2 months before I felt safe enough to come back and try to rebuild my life. And he's been looking for you ever since," Dante concluded. Sophia nodded, setting down her fork as her appetite disappeared again. "I thought I had been so careful. I moved to a completely different part of town, got a new job, changed everything about my routine. But somehow he found me anyway. Men like that don't give up easily," Dante said, his voice taking on a harder edge. "They see their victims as possessions, not people. The idea that you might have a life without him, that you might be happier without him, is something he can't accept." The casual way he spoke about Marcus's psychology, as if he had encountered this type of situation before, made Sophia wonder again about the nature of Dante's business. But she was too exhausted to pursue the question, and part of her suspected she wouldn't like the answers anyway. "What happens now?" she asked instead. "I can't hide here forever, and I can't quit my job. I barely make enough to cover my expenses as it is." Dante reached across the island and covered her hand with his, the simple contact sending unexpected warmth up her arm. "Now you rest," he said firmly. "Tomorrow we'll figure out a longer-term solution. But tonight, you're safe. That's all you need to worry about right now." As he showed her to the guest room, Sophia found herself studying his face in the soft light from the hallway. There was something compelling about Dante Marcelli that went beyond his obvious wealth and power. Something in the way he had taken care of her tonight, anticipating her needs and addressing them without being asked. When was the last time anyone had shown her such careful consideration? The guest room was elegantly appointed with a king-sized bed and an en-suite bathroom that rivaled the nicest hotel she had ever stayed in. Dante provided her with a soft cotton t-shirt to sleep in and showed her where to find extra blankets and toiletries. "Thank you," she said as he prepared to leave her alone for the night. "For everything. I don't know how I'll ever repay you for what you did tonight." Dante paused in the doorway, his expression unreadable. "You don't owe me anything, Sophia. Everyone deserves to feel safe in their own life. Sleep well." After he left, Sophia sat on the edge of the massive bed and tried to process everything that had happened. 8 hours ago, she had been worried about nothing more challenging than making enough tips to cover her electric bill. Now she was in a stranger's penthouse, under the protection of a man who could intimidate her abusive ex-boyfriend with just a conversation. But as she finally crawled under the impossibly soft sheets and closed her eyes, she realized that for the first time in 8 months, she felt truly safe. And despite all the unknowns about Dante and his world, despite the rational voice in her head warning her to be careful, she found herself hoping that this feeling might last longer than just one night. Sophia woke to the smell of coffee and something that might have been bacon, filtered through the haze of the deepest sleep she had experienced in months. For a few blissful moments, she lay still with her eyes closed, luxuriating in the feeling of being truly rested. The bed was impossibly comfortable, the sheets soft against her skin, and the silence around her spoke of quality construction and expensive soundproofing. Then reality crashed back in a rush of memory. Marcus in the restaurant. Dante's intervention. The drive to this penthouse sanctuary. She was in a stranger's home, wearing his t-shirt, completely dependent on his protection and goodwill. The vulnerability of her situation should have terrified her, but instead she found herself oddly calm as she remembered the way he had taken care of her the night before. Sunlight streamed through the floor-to-ceiling windows as she made her way to the main living area, still wearing the soft cotton shirt he had given her to sleep in. It fell to mid-thigh, modest enough, but clearly not her own clothes. She felt exposed and grateful at the same time, acutely aware of how much her life had changed in the span of 12 hours. Dante stood at the kitchen island with his back to her, dressed in dark jeans and a white button-down shirt that emphasized the breadth of his shoulders. His hair was still damp from a shower, and she could smell the clean scent of his soap mixed with the rich aroma of coffee. There was something intensely domestic about the scene that made her chest tighten with unexpected longing. "Good morning," he said without turning around, somehow sensing her presence before she had made any sound. "Did you sleep well?" "Better than I have in months," she admitted, surprised by her own honesty. The admission felt too intimate, too revealing of how badly her life had deteriorated before last night. Dante turned to face her, and she saw his eyes take in her appearance with a quick, appreciative glance that he didn't try to hide. There was nothing predatory in his gaze, but there was definitely masculine awareness that sent warmth spiraling through her stomach. When was the last time a man had looked at her like that? Like she was something worth appreciating rather than something to be controlled? "I made breakfast," he said, gesturing to plates of eggs Benedict that looked restaurant quality, "and coffee strong enough to wake the dead. You'll need your strength today." The implication that today would bring its own challenges sent a chill through her newfound sense of security. "What happens today?" she asked, accepting the cup of coffee he offered her and wrapping her hands around the warm ceramic. "Today we figure out how to keep you safe long-term," Dante replied, his expression becoming more serious. "But first, we need to assess the full scope of the problem. I've already had someone check your apartment building this morning." "Someone?" Sophia set down her coffee cup with trembling hands. "You had someone watching my apartment? How did you even know where I live?" Dante's expression didn't change, but she caught something that might have been regret flickering across his features. "Sophia, when someone threatens a woman under my protection, I gather information quickly. Your safety depends on understanding exactly what we're dealing with." Before she could fully process the implications of that statement, the sound of the elevator arriving echoed through the apartment. Dante moved with fluid efficiency, pressing a button on a panel by the kitchen that she hadn't noticed the night before. "Marco, send him up," came a voice through the intercom. Dante turned back to her with an expression that was half apology, half warning. "Someone is coming up to brief us on the situation. His name is Marco, and he works for me. Just remember that everything we discuss is about keeping you safe." The man who emerged from the elevator a few minutes later was not what Sophia had expected. Marco appeared to be in his late 20s, with an easy smile and the kind of casual confidence that suggested he was comfortable in his own skin. He was dressed in well-tailored casual clothes and carried himself like someone who was used to being liked wherever he went. But his eyes, when they settled on Sophia, were sharp and assessing in a way that reminded her of Dante. "You must be Sophia," Marco said, extending his hand with a warm smile. "I'm Marco Romano, Dante's second-in-command. I've heard a lot about you." "Second-in-command of what?" The question formed in Sophia's mind even as she shook his offered hand, but the polite smile on Marco's face and the careful way both men, were watching her reaction told her that she probably didn't want to know the answer. "Marco, what did you find?" Dante asked, his tone becoming all business. Marco's expression grew more serious as he pulled out his phone and scrolled through what appeared to be photos. "Your ex-boyfriend paid a visit to your apartment around 3 this morning," he said to Sophia. "The landlord let him in after he claimed to be your boyfriend who was locked out. Unfortunately, he wasn't in a very good mood after his encounter with Dante last night." He showed her the phone screen, and Sophia's stomach dropped as she saw images of her small studio apartment. Her furniture was overturned, her clothes scattered across the floor, her few precious belongings smashed and broken. The little succulent plant her sister had given her lay dead in its broken pot, soil scattered across her ruined books. "Oh God," she whispered, sinking onto one of the bar stools as the full reality hit her. "That was everything I had. Everything I built after I left him." Dante moved immediately to stand beside her, his hand settling on her shoulder in a gesture that was both comforting and possessive. The warmth of his touch helped ground her as she stared at the destruction of her carefully reconstructed life. "It gets worse," Marco continued gently. "He left a message spray-painted on your bedroom wall. Should I tell her, or do you want to see the photo?" "Tell me," Sophia said, forcing her voice to remain steady. "I need to know what I'm dealing with." He wrote, "You can't hide from me forever, bitch. I'll find you wherever you go." Marco's voice was carefully neutral, but she could see the anger simmering beneath his professional demeanor. "Also, the neighbor across the hall said he was asking questions about your schedule, your friends, anyone who might be helping you." Sophia felt the last of her illusions about returning to her normal life crumble away. Marcus hadn't just found her workplace by accident. He had been systematically hunting her, gathering information, planning his approach. The apartment she could no longer afford to keep had never really been a sanctuary anyway. "I'm calling the police," she said, reaching for her phone with shaking hands. Dante's hand covered hers before she could dial. "Sophia, I need you to think about this carefully. What exactly are you going to tell them? That your ex-boyfriend, who you left 8 months ago, broke into your apartment and destroyed your things? That he's been stalking you, but you have no proof beyond his showing up at your workplace once?" The truth in his words was devastating. She had no evidence beyond the destruction of her apartment, which Marcus could easily claim was the result of a domestic dispute. The police would take a report, maybe increase patrols in the area for a few days, but ultimately there would be little they could do until Marcus actually hurt her. "The system isn't designed to protect women like you," Marco added quietly. "It's designed to respond after something terrible has already happened. But we're not the system." The implication in his words finally penetrated her shock and grief. These men weren't just successful businessmen with connections. They were something else entirely, something that operated outside the boundaries of law and conventional society. The realization should have terrified her, should have sent her running toward the nearest police station despite the futility of that option. Instead, she found herself studying Dante's face as he waited for her reaction. There was no deception there, no attempt to hide what he was from her. He was giving her the chance to make an informed decision about accepting his protection, even if it meant accepting protection from someone who lived in a world she had never imagined. "What exactly is your business?" she asked, her voice steadier than she felt. Dante exchanged a glance with Marco before answering. "We provide security services for people and businesses in certain neighborhoods," he said carefully. "We also resolve disputes that can't be handled through conventional channels. Sometimes that means dealing with people who don't respond to reasonable requests to leave others alone." It was a sanitized way of describing what was probably organized crime, but Sophia found herself oddly comforted by his honesty about being dishonest. At least he wasn't treating her like she was too naive to understand the implications. "Have you ever hurt anyone who didn't deserve it?" she asked, the question surprising her with its directness. Dante's eyes never left hers as he answered. "I've never hurt anyone who wasn't threatening someone under my protection. I've never taken money from people who couldn't afford to lose it. And I've never forced anyone to do anything they didn't choose to do freely." It wasn't exactly a declaration of innocence, but it was a code of ethics of sorts. And given her current situation, the distinction between legal and moral was becoming increasingly irrelevant. Marco cleared his throat gently. "There's something else," he said. "We ran the ex-boyfriend's information through our contacts." Marcus Caldwell has been fired from 2 jobs in the past 6 months for harassment. There are 3 other women who have filed restraining orders against him in different states. This isn't his first time stalking an ex-girlfriend. The information hit Sophia like a physical blow. She hadn't been Marcus's first victim, and if he wasn't stopped, she wouldn't be his last. The thought of other women going through what she had experienced, the terror and isolation and constant fear, made her stomach churn with rage and helplessness. "What do you recommend?" she asked, looking between the 2 men who seemed to understand the reality of her situation better than she did. "You stay here where you're safe while we handle the Marcus problem permanently," Dante said without hesitation. "No more showing up at your workplace, no more destroying your things, no more threatening messages. He learns to accept that you're off limits, or he faces consequences that will make him reconsider his priorities. And if I say no, if I decide to try handling this through official channels, then we'll respect your choice and help you contact the right people," Marco said. "But we won't be able to protect you once you're back in the system." And based on his escalation pattern, he's not going to stop until someone makes him stop. Sophia looked around the penthouse, at the luxury and security it represented, and then thought about her destroyed apartment and the message painted on her bedroom wall. The choice wasn't really between safety and danger. It was between accepting help from dangerous men or facing a dangerous man alone. What would handling the Marcus problem permanently actually involve? She asked, needing to understand exactly what she would be agreeing to. Dante's expression grew colder, and for a moment she caught a glimpse of what Marcus had seen in the parking lot the night before. "Let us worry about the details," he said quietly. "But I can promise you that when we're finished, he'll understand that pursuing you any further would be a serious mistake." The implications were clear, even if the specifics remained unspoken. Whatever they were planning to do to Marcus would be final and effective, but it wouldn't be legal. Accepting Dante's protection meant accepting that justice in her case would be delivered outside the boundaries of conventional law. Looking at the photos of her destroyed life on Marco's phone, Sophia realized that the conventional approach had already failed her. The system had given her a piece of paper that was supposed to keep Marcus away, but he had found her anyway. The system would tell her to change her number again, move again, hide again. But how many times could she rebuild her life only to watch him tear it down? "Okay," she said quietly. "Help me. But I want to understand what's happening every step of the way. No more surprises. No more decisions made without consulting me first." Dante's smile when she agreed was warm enough to melt glaciers. "You have my word," he said. "And Sophia, for what it's worth, I think you're braver than you know. Most people wouldn't have the courage to make the choice you just made." As Marco left to begin whatever process would neutralize the Marcus threat, Sophia found herself alone with Dante again. The domestic intimacy of sharing breakfast in his kitchen felt different now that she knew what he was. More dangerous, perhaps, but also more real. There were no more pretenses between them, no more polite fiction about him being just another customer at the diner. "Thank you," she said as she watched him clear away their breakfast dishes with the same controlled competence he applied to everything else. "For being honest with me. For giving me a choice, even if it wasn't really much of a choice." Dante paused in his cleaning to look at her directly. "There's always a choice, Sophia. The fact that all your options are difficult doesn't mean you don't have agency in your own life. Don't ever forget that." Standing in his pristine kitchen, wearing his shirt, accepting protection from a man whose business she still didn't fully understand, Sophia realized that for the first time in longer than she could remember, she felt like she had some measure of control over her own fate. It was a strange and terrifying kind of freedom, but it was freedom nonetheless. 3 days passed in a strange sort of suspended reality, where Sophia found herself living in luxury while her old life disappeared piece by piece. Dante had arranged for her things to be professionally cleaned and restored where possible, but most of her belongings had been too damaged to salvage. Instead of feeling devastated by the loss, she discovered an unexpected sense of liberation in starting fresh. The penthouse began to feel less like a temporary shelter and more like a sanctuary. Dante worked from a home office during the day, taking meetings that she politely pretended not to overhear, while she found herself settling into a routine she had never imagined possible. He had arranged for new clothes to be delivered, simple but well-made pieces that fit her perfectly and made her feel more like herself than she had in months. They fell into an easy domestic rhythm that felt both natural and surreal. Dante would make coffee in the mornings while she prepared simple breakfast. Their movements coordinated around each other with surprising grace for two people who barely knew each other. In the evenings, they would cook dinner together, Dante teaching her techniques he had learned from his grandmother while she shared the few family recipes she remembered from before her parents died. It was during one of these quiet evening cooking sessions that the walls between them finally began to come down. They were making pasta from scratch, Dante's hands covering hers as he showed her how to work the dough, when he mentioned his mother in passing. "She would have liked you," he said quietly, his breath warm against her ear as he guided her hands. "She always said you could tell everything about a person by how they treated food, whether they rushed through it or took time to do it properly." "Would have?" Sophia asked, turning in the circle of his arms to face him. The movement brought them closer together than she had intended, close enough that she could see the gold flecks in his dark eyes and smell the clean scent of his cologne. "She died when I was 16, Dante said, his hands still resting lightly on her waist. "Cancer. But before that, she spent most of my childhood trying to protect me from my father's temper." The words hung between them, heavy with implication and shared understanding. Sophia felt her heart clench with recognition and sympathy. "You grew up with violence too," she said softly. "That's how you knew exactly what to do when Marcus showed up." Dante's jaw tightened almost imperceptibly. "My father was what people politely called old school. He believed in settling disputes with his fists, whether those disputes were with business associates or with his wife and son. My mother spent years making excuses for bruises and broken bones, teaching me to stay quiet and invisible when he came home angry." Sophia's hands came up to rest on his chest, feeling the steady rhythm of his heartbeat beneath her palms. The gesture was meant to comfort, but the warmth of his skin through the thin cotton of his shirt sent unexpected heat spiraling through her body. "When did it stop?" she asked. "When I got big enough to stop it myself," Dante replied, his voice taking on a harder edge. "The first time I put him on the ground, he never laid a hand on either of us again. But by then, the damage was done. My mother never really recovered from all those years of fear." The parallel between their stories was impossible to ignore, but where Sophia had escaped her abuser, Dante had grown strong enough to fight back. She found herself wondering what might have happened to her if she had been physically capable of defending herself against Marcus, whether she would have found her strength sooner or if the violence would have simply escalated until someone was seriously hurt. "Is that why you do what you do now?" she asked. "Protect people who can't protect themselves?" Dante's hands tightened slightly on her waist, pulling her fractionally closer. "Partly," he admitted, "but also because I learned early that there are people in this world who only understand one kind of language. The legal system, social workers, counselors, they all mean well. But they can't stop a man who has decided that another person belongs to him." The truth of his words resonated deep in her chest. She had tried all the conventional routes during her relationship with Marcus. She had called the police twice, only to watch them leave after Marcus charmed them with explanations about domestic misunderstandings. She had sought counseling, but the therapist had focused on communication strategies that assumed both parties wanted the relationship to work. She had confided in friends, only to have them suggest she was overreacting or that all relationships required compromise. It wasn't until her sister had seen the physical evidence of abuse that anyone had taken her situation seriously enough to help her escape. And even then, the system had failed to keep Marcus away for more than 8 months. "I tried everything before I left him," she said quietly, her voice barely above a whisper. "I kept thinking if I just explained the right way, if I just found the right words, he would understand that he was hurting me and choose to stop. I made excuses for him the same way your mother made excuses for your father." Dante's thumb began stroking gently along her ribs, the simple touch somehow more intimate than anything she had experienced in years. "What finally made you realize it wasn't your fault?" he asked. "The day he gave me a black eye, and then convinced me to tell people I had walked into a door," Sophia said, the memory still painful even after all these months. "I was standing in the bathroom looking at my reflection, practicing the lie he had taught me, when I realized I didn't recognize the woman in the mirror. She was afraid of everything, apologetic for existing, constantly walking on eggshells. That wasn't who I used to be, and I knew that if I stayed, She was who I would become permanently. Dante's expression grew fierce with protective anger. He had no right to take that from you, he said quietly. No right to make you afraid of your own reflection. The intensity in his voice, the genuine fury on her behalf, broke something loose in Sophia's chest that she had been keeping carefully controlled for months. Tears she had been holding back began to fall, not from sadness, but from the overwhelming relief of being truly seen and understood by someone who recognized the magnitude of what she had endured. Hey, Dante said softly, his hands coming up to frame her face, thumbs gently brushing away her tears. You're safe now. He can't touch who you really are, no matter what he tried to make you believe. The tenderness in his touch, the careful way he held her as if she were something precious, made her heart race for reasons that had nothing to do with fear. When was the last time someone had touched her with such reverence? When had anyone looked at her like she was worth protecting rather than controlling? Dante, she whispered, her hands sliding up to rest against his neck. His skin was warm beneath her fingers, and she could feel the slight tremor that ran through him at her touch. Tell me to stop, he said quietly, his voice rough with barely controlled desire. Tell me you're not ready for this, and I'll step back right now. Instead of answering with words, Sophia rose on her toes and closed the distance between them. Their first kiss was gentle, tentative, as if they were both afraid of moving too fast or asking for too much. But when she sighed against his lips and pressed closer, Dante's control seemed to slip just enough to let her feel the depth of his want. His arms came around her properly then, one hand sliding into her hair while the other pressed against the small of her back, holding her against the solid warmth of his chest. The kiss deepened gradually, becoming something that spoke of patience and hunger in equal measure. Sophia felt something inside her chest unfurl like a flower in sunlight, a warmth and rightness that she had forgotten was possible. When they finally broke apart, both breathing heavily, Dante rested his forehead against hers. That was, he started, then seemed to lose track of what he had intended to say. Worth waiting for, Sophia finished for him, surprised by her own boldness. The woman Marcus had tried to create would never have been confident enough to express desire so directly. But that woman was disappearing more each day, replaced by someone who remembered her own worth. They might have stayed there indefinitely, wrapped in each other in the warm bubble of new intimacy, if Dante's phone hadn't begun ringing with the specific tone he had assigned to urgent calls. He answered it without stepping away from her, keeping one arm around her waist as if he couldn't bear to lose the connection. What is it, Marco? Dante asked, his voice sharp with the kind of focus that suggested the call was business-related. Sophia couldn't hear Marco's words, but she could see Dante's expression growing darker and more dangerous as he listened. The transformation was remarkable and slightly frightening, watching him shift from tender lover to something much more predatory in the span of seconds. When? Dante asked, his tone clipped and professional. Are you certain it was him? The questions he was asking sent ice through Sophia's veins, and she found herself holding her breath as she waited for whatever bad news was coming. I'll handle it, Dante said finally. Double the security on the sister immediately, and I want eyes on every member of her family until this is resolved. He hung up and turned to Sophia with an expression that was carefully controlled. What happened? She asked, though she already suspected she wouldn't like the answer. Marcus contacted your sister this afternoon, Dante said gently. He told her that he knows where she works and where her daughter goes to school. He wants to arrange a meeting with you, and he's using your family as leverage to ensure you'll agree. The bottom dropped out of Sophia's world. She had known intellectually that Marcus was dangerous, that his obsession with her went beyond rational behavior. But the idea that he would threaten her sister and 5-year-old niece transformed her fear into something much more primal and desperate. Emma, she whispered, thinking of her sister's bright, curious daughter who called her Aunt Sophie and drew pictures of unicorns. He wouldn't actually hurt a child, would he? Dante's expression was answer enough. Men like Marcus don't see other people as fully human, he said quietly. They're objects to be used for leverage. Your niece isn't a child to him. She's a tool to control your behavior. The realization that her decision to accept Dante's protection had inadvertently put her family in danger made her feel sick with guilt and terror. I have to meet with him, she said, already moving toward where she had left her phone. I have to do whatever he wants to keep Emma safe. Dante caught her hand before she could reach the phone. Absolutely not, he said firmly. That's exactly what he wants, and giving in to his demands won't keep your family safe. It will only prove to him that threatening them is an effective way to control you. Then what do we do? Sophia asked, hearing the edge of panic in her own voice. I can't let him hurt them because of me. We protect them, Dante said simply. Marco is already arranging security for your sister and niece. By tonight, they'll have protection that Marcus can't get through, and he'll understand that his leverage has disappeared. Then we end this permanently. The certainty in his voice, the absolute confidence that he could keep her family safe while neutralizing the threat Marcus represented, should have been comforting. Instead, it reminded her of exactly how different Dante's world was from anything she had ever known. He spoke of arranging security and ending threats the way other people talked about making dinner reservations. But as she thought about Emma's innocent smile and her sister's voice shaking with fear during Marcus's threatening phone call, Sophia realized she was grateful to be in the orbit of someone with the power to protect the people she loved. Whatever moral ambiguity came with accepting help from a man like Dante seemed insignificant compared to keeping her family safe from Marcus's escalating obsession. Promise me they'll be safe, she said, looking directly into his eyes. Promise me that whatever happens to me, Marcus will never get near Emma. Dante's hands framed her face again, his touch gentle despite the steel in his voice. I promise you that your family will be protected, he said solemnly. And I promise you that Marcus Caldwell has made his last threat against anyone you care about. After tonight, he'll understand that you belong to someone who won't hesitate to destroy anyone who tries to hurt you. The possessiveness in his words should have alarmed her, should have reminded her of Marcus's need to own and control. But coming from Dante, after everything he had done to earn her trust, it felt like a vow of protection rather than a claim of ownership. She belonged to him not because he had taken her agency away, but because she had chosen to give him her trust and her heart. As night fell over the city, Sophia found herself preparing for whatever confrontation would finally end Marcus's hold over her life. She didn't know exactly what Dante and his people were planning, but she knew that tomorrow she would either be truly free or Marcus would have succeeded in destroying everything she cared about. Either way, the liminal space she had been living in for the past 8 months was finally coming to an end. The call came at 4 in the morning, jolting Sophia from the first peaceful sleep she had experienced since learning about Marcus's threats against her family. Dante answered his phone before the second ring, his voice instantly alert despite having been sound asleep moments before. Talk to me, he said, and even in her drowsy state, Sophia could hear the dangerous edge that entered his tone as he listened to whoever was on the other end. When? How long? His questions were clipped and professional, but she could feel the tension radiating from his body as he sat up in bed. The security team you assigned to her, what happened to them? Sophia came fully awake as the implications of the conversation became clear. Something had gone wrong with her sister's protection. She sat up beside Dante, her heart hammering against her ribs as she watched his face grow harder and more frightening with each piece of information he received. I understand, Dante said finally. Send me the location. We'll be there in 20 minutes. He hung up and turned to face her, his expression carefully controlled in the way that she had learned meant he was furious but trying not to frighten her. Marcus took your sister, he said without preamble. He grabbed her when she was leaving work tonight. The security team tried to intervene, but he had help this time. Professional help. The words hit her like physical blows, driving the air from her lungs and making the room spin around her. Lily, her baby sister who had saved her from Marcus in the first place, who had a 5-year-old daughter and a job she loved and a whole life that had nothing to do with Sophia's mistakes. Marcus had taken her because hurting Sophia directly hadn't been enough to satisfy his need for control. Where's Emma? Sophia managed to ask, thinking of her niece with desperate terror. Safe with your sister's neighbor, a woman Marcus doesn't know about, Dante replied. Marco arranged alternate protection the moment we learned about the threat. Emma is completely secure. The relief that her niece was safe warred with the devastating knowledge that Lily was in Marcus's hands because of her. If Sophia had never gotten involved with him, if she had been stronger and left him sooner, if she had handled the situation differently, none of this would have happened. This is my fault, she said, her voice breaking on the words. He took her to get to me. Lily is in danger because I wasn't strong enough to stop this before it got this far. Dante moved with swift efficiency, pulling on clothes while he spoke. This is not your fault, Sophia. This is Marcus choosing to escalate to kidnapping because his previous tactics failed. You are not responsible for the actions of a man who has decided that violence is an acceptable way to get what he wants. He handed her clothes from the dresser, his movements urgent but still careful. We're going to get her back, he continued. I have people who specialize in exactly this type of situation. But I need you to understand that what happens next is going to be violent and final. Marcus isn't going to survive this confrontation. The statement should have shocked her, should have made her recoil from the man she had come to care about. Instead, she felt only a fierce sense of satisfaction that Marcus would finally face consequences that matched the magnitude of his crimes. He had terrorized her, destroyed her life, and now he had taken her sister. Whatever Dante was planning to do to him was justice, even if it wasn't legal. Good, she said simply, surprised by the venom in her own voice. He's hurt too many people. If stopping him permanently is the only way to keep other women safe, then that's what needs to happen. Dante paused in his preparations to study her face, as if checking to make sure she truly understood what she was agreeing to. When he seemed satisfied that she meant what she said, he nodded grimly and continued gathering what appeared to be specialized equipment from a hidden panel in his closet. I'm coming with you, Sophia said as she pulled on the clothes he had given her. Absolutely not, Dante replied without hesitation. You're staying here where you're safe. I'm not risking you being used as additional leverage in case this goes wrong. She caught his arm as he moved toward the door. Dante, she's my sister. I can't sit here doing nothing while she's in danger because of me. I need to be there. The internal struggle was visible on his face as he weighed her emotional need to help against his protective instincts. Finally, he sighed in defeat. You stay in the vehicle at all times, he said firmly. You don't move. You don't get out. You don't try to help no matter what you see or hear. If something goes wrong and I tell you to run, you run without looking back. Understood? Understood, Sophia agreed, though she had no intention of running if it meant leaving her sister behind. The warehouse where Marcus was holding Lily was in an industrial district that looked abandoned even during daylight hours. At 4:30 in the morning, surrounded by empty lots and shuttered businesses, it felt like the edge of the world. Marco met them in the parking lot with 3 other men who moved with the same controlled competence she had observed in Dante. He's got her in the main floor office, Marco reported quietly. 2 men with him, both armed. He's demanding to speak with Sophia directly. Says he'll start hurting the sister if she doesn't show up within the hour. Dante's jaw clenched as he processed the information. What about building security? Exits? Any indication of how professional his backup really is? Former military, Marco replied grimly. The kind of men you hire when you want someone hurt badly but kept alive for questioning. This isn't amateur hour anymore. The knowledge that Marcus had escalated to hiring professional muscle to help him terrorize her family filled Sophia with a cold rage that she had never experienced before. This was beyond obsession, beyond even stalking. This was a calculated campaign of terror designed to destroy her life and hurt anyone who tried to help her. From the back seat of Dante's Mercedes, Sophia watched the men coordinate their approach with the kind of precision that spoke of extensive experience with exactly this type of situation. They moved like a military unit, each person knowing their role and executing it without discussion or hesitation. Dante appeared at her window before they began their final approach. Remember what I said, he told her quietly. No matter what happens, you stay in this vehicle. I will bring your sister back to you safely, but I need to know you're secure before I can focus completely on the rescue. The last thing she saw before he disappeared into the shadows was his face, transformed into something predatory and dangerous that bore little resemblance to the gentle man who had cooked breakfast with her that morning. This was the side of Dante that Marcus was about to encounter, and she found herself hoping that Marcus was terrified when he realized what kind of enemy he had made. 20 minutes passed in agonizing silence before she heard the first sounds of confrontation echoing from inside the warehouse. Shouting, then what might have been gunshots, then more shouting followed by a silence that stretched until she thought she might go insane from waiting. When the warehouse door finally opened, Dante emerged with Lily in his arms. Her sister was conscious and walking, though she moved with the careful gait of someone who had been hurt, but was trying not to show it. Relief flooded through Sophia so powerfully that she felt dizzy. But it was what she saw in Dante's face that stopped her breath entirely. There was blood on his shirt and his knuckles were raw, but his expression was one of grim satisfaction. Whatever had happened inside the warehouse had been final and definitive. Lily collapsed into Sophia's arms the moment she was close enough, both sisters crying and holding each other with desperate relief. It was several minutes before either of them could speak coherently enough to do more than confirm that they were both alive and relatively unharmed. "He's dead, isn't he?" Sophia asked Dante quietly while Lily was being checked over by one of his men who apparently had medical training. Dante nodded without any attempt to soften the truth. "Marcus Caldwell will never threaten you or anyone else again," he said simply. "The men he hired are also no longer a concern. This is over, Sophia. Completely over." The finality in his voice should have bothered her more than it did. Instead, she felt something inside her chest uncoil for the first time in months, a tension she had carried for so long that she had forgotten what it felt like to be without it. Marcus was gone. The man who had made her afraid of her own shadow, who had tried to convince her she was worthless, who had nearly destroyed her sister to maintain his control over her, would never hurt anyone again. "Thank you," she whispered, knowing the words were inadequate for what he had done, but needing to say them anyway. Later, after Lily had been safely returned to her daughter and given security that would remain in place until they were certain all threats had been eliminated, Sophia found herself back in Dante's penthouse with a man who had killed to protect her family. The knowledge should have changed everything between them, should have made her see him differently. Instead, as she watched him carefully cleaning the blood from his knuckles at the kitchen sink, she felt only overwhelming gratitude and a desire so intense it made her shake. This man had risked everything to keep her safe, had eliminated a threat that the legal system couldn't touch, had given her the freedom to live without fear for the first time in years. "Dante," she said softly, moving to stand beside him at the sink. He turned to face her, his expression uncertain. "I know what I did changes things between us," he said quietly. "I know that seeing what I'm capable of probably makes you see me differently. If you need time to process this, or if you want me to arrange somewhere else for you to stay while you figure things out, I understand." Instead of answering with words, Sophia reached up and framed his face with her hands, looking directly into his eyes so he could see that she meant what she was about to say. "You saved my sister's life," she said firmly. "You ended a nightmare that had been destroying my family. You gave me my freedom back. How could that make me see you as anything other than exactly the man I want to be with?" When she kissed him this time, there was no hesitation, no careful testing of boundaries. This was a claiming, a declaration that she knew exactly who he was and wanted him anyway. Dante responded with matching intensity, his control finally slipping enough to let her feel the full force of his desire for her. They made love that night with the desperate passion of two people who had found each other in the darkness and refused to let go. Every touch was a celebration of survival. Every kiss a promise of protection and devotion that went deeper than words could express. Sophia gave herself to him completely, holding nothing back, finally free to love someone without fear of the consequences. In the quiet aftermath, as they lay entwined in his bed watching the sun rise over a city where Marcus could never threaten her again, Sophia realized that she had finally found what she had been looking for without knowing it. Not just safety, but a partner strong enough to stand between her and any danger, gentle enough to tend her wounds, and devoted enough to eliminate any threat to their happiness. She was free, she was protected, and she was exactly where she belonged. 2 weeks after the warehouse confrontation, Sophia stood in Dante's kitchen making coffee and marveling at how completely her life had transformed. The woman who had been afraid to walk to her car alone just months ago was now planning a future with a man whose very presence made her feel invincible. The contrast was so dramatic it sometimes felt like she was living someone else's life. The penthouse had become home in a way her tiny studio apartment never had. She had moved her few remaining possessions from storage, but more importantly, she had moved herself, completely and irrevocably. There was no part of her that wanted to return to the half-life she had been living before Dante intervened. No nostalgia for the exhausted, frightened woman who had jumped at every unexpected sound. Dante emerged from his office looking satisfied in the way that meant he had concluded some piece of business successfully. His hair was slightly mussed from running his hands through it, and there was a slight smile playing around his lips that made her stomach flutter with anticipation. "Good news?" she asked, handing him the coffee she had prepared exactly the way he liked it. "The best news," he replied, accepting the cup and pulling her close with his free arm. "The investigation into Marcus and his associates is officially closed. As far as the authorities are concerned, Marcus Caldwell and the men he hired disappeared while fleeing the jurisdiction to avoid federal charges related to their other activities." The relief that washed through her was profound, even though she had known intellectually that Marcus was no longer a threat. Having official confirmation that there would be no legal complications, no awkward questions about what had happened in that warehouse, meant they were truly free to move forward. "What other activities?" she asked, curious despite herself. It turns out Marcus had been involved in several interstate stalking cases, identity theft, and harassment campaigns against multiple women, Dante explained. "When my people looked into his background more thoroughly, they found evidence of a pattern that went back years. The authorities are actually relieved he's gone, even if they don't know exactly what happened to him." The knowledge that Marcus had been an even worse person than she had realized should have been disturbing. Instead, it only reinforced her conviction that the world was better without him in it. How many other women might he have terrorized if Dante hadn't stopped him permanently? "There's something else," Dante continued, setting down his coffee cup and turning to face her fully. "Something I've been wanting to discuss with you now that this situation is completely resolved." The seriousness in his tone made her pulse quicken, but not with fear. There was anticipation in his voice, and something that might have been nervousness, which was intriguing from a man who never seemed uncertain about anything. "I want you to meet my family," he said quietly. "My grandmother, my cousins, the people who matter to me. They've been asking about the woman who's been staying here, and I want them to understand that you're not just staying here. You're home." The distinction was important, and they both knew it. Staying implied temporary. Home implied permanence, belonging, a place in his world that went far beyond the crisis that had brought them together. "Are you sure that's what you want?" Sophia asked, needing to hear him say it explicitly. "Your life was a certain way before I came into it. Complicated in ways I'm sure I don't fully understand, but stable. I don't want you to feel obligated to include me just because of what happened with Marcus." Dante's hands came up to frame her face, his thumbs stroking gently across her cheekbones. "Sophia," he said quietly, "you didn't complicate my life. You completed it. I spent years thinking I was satisfied with control and solitude, with managing my responsibilities and protecting my territory. But being with you has shown me the difference between existing and living." The intensity in his voice made her heart race, but it was the vulnerability she could see in his eyes that made her fall in love with him all over again. This powerful, dangerous man who could eliminate threats and command respect from everyone around him was nervous about whether she wanted to be part of his life permanently. "Yes," she said simply. "I want to meet your family. I want to understand your world completely. I want to build a life with you, whatever that looks like." The smile that spread across Dante's face was brilliant enough to power the entire city. He kissed her then, slow and deep and full of promise, and she could taste their future in that kiss. Meeting the Marcelli family was like being inducted into a secret society that valued loyalty above everything else. Dante's grandmother, Nana Isabella, was a tiny woman in her 80s with sharp eyes and an iron will who clearly ran the family despite her advanced age. She took one look at Sophia and declared her troppo magra, too thin, before launching into rapid-fire Italian that involved extensive gesturing and apparent meal planning. His cousins were equally warm but more subtle in their assessment, asking careful questions designed to determine whether Sophia understood what it meant to be part of Dante's life. Not just the danger, which they seemed to assume she had already accepted, but the responsibility. The knowledge that being with him meant being part of a family that looked after its own but expected absolute loyalty in return. "She fits," Nana Isabella announced after dinner, speaking directly to Dante, as if Sophia weren't sitting right beside him. "She has spine, this one, and she looks at you like you're not just pretty but also smart. Those are hard to find together." The endorsement from the family matriarch was apparently the final seal of approval Sophia needed. By the end of the evening, she had been assigned a role in the community center the family funded, given standing invitations to weekly Sunday dinners, and informed that she would be expected to learn Nana Isabella's secret sauce recipe. Over the following weeks, Sophia discovered that being part of Dante's world meant more than just sharing his bed and his protection. She became involved in the legitimate businesses that provided cover for his other activities, worked at the community center that served families in the neighborhood, and learned the intricate network of relationships that made up his extended family. The work was fulfilling in a way her previous jobs had never been. At the community center, she helped coordinate services for women escaping domestic violence, using her own experience to provide support and understanding that traditional counselors sometimes couldn't offer. It felt like turning her trauma into something useful, something that could help other women find their way to safety and freedom. 3 months after Marcus's death, Dante took her to dinner at the same restaurant where they had shared their first real conversation about their pasts. But this time, instead of seeking comfort in shared wounds, they were celebrating how far they had both come. "I have something for you," Dante said after they had finished their meal, reaching into his jacket pocket. The ring he produced was exquisite, a classic solitaire that caught the candlelight and threw it back in brilliant flashes. But it wasn't the size or beauty of the diamond that made Sophia's breath catch. It was the solemnity in Dante's expression, the careful way he held the small velvet box, as if it contained something infinitely precious. "Sophia-chan," he said quietly, his voice carrying clearly despite the intimate volume. "6 months ago, I thought I knew what my life was supposed to look like. I thought strength meant standing alone, that protection meant keeping everyone at a distance. You changed all of that. You made me understand that real strength comes from having something worth protecting, someone worth fighting for. Will you marry me?" The proposal was everything she had never known she wanted. Not a grand gesture designed to impress onlookers, but a quiet declaration of devotion spoken by a man who had proven his commitment in the most fundamental way possible. He had seen her at her most vulnerable and chosen to build her up rather than tear her down. He had eliminated the threat to her safety and then given her the tools to rebuild her life stronger than before. "Yes," she said, her voice steady despite the tears streaming down her face. "Yes, absolutely yes." The ring fit perfectly, which didn't surprise her. Dante was the kind of man who paid attention to details, who planned carefully for the things that mattered to him. As he slipped the platinum band onto her finger, Sophia realized that this was the moment her new life truly began. Not when Marcus died, not when she moved into the penthouse, but right now, when she chose forever with the man who had given her back her courage. 6 months later, Sophia stood in the ballroom of the hotel where their engagement party was being held, surrounded by a mix of people that perfectly represented their merged worlds. Her sister Lily was there with Emma, who was fascinated by the elaborate decorations and the fancy clothes. Nana Isabella held court at a central table, regaling anyone who would listen with stories about Dante as a child. Marco and the other men she had come to think of as extended family moved through the crowd with the alertness that never completely left them, but tonight they were celebrating rather than guarding. The woman in the mirror that morning had been confident and radiant, wearing a silver dress that made her feel beautiful and strong. Her hair was styled elegantly, her makeup perfect, but it was the light in her eyes that made her barely recognize herself. This was what happiness looked like, what safety and love and belonging could create when they were given room to flourish. Dante appeared beside her, resplendent in a perfectly tailored tuxedo that emphasized his natural elegance and power. Even in celebration, there was something about him that commanded attention and respect, but when he looked at her, all of that intensity focused into pure adoration. "Any regrets?" he asked quietly, taking her hand and running his thumb over her engagement ring. "About leaving behind my old life to marry a dangerous man who solved my problems by eliminating them permanently?" Sophia replied with a smile that felt like sunshine. "Not even one." The band began playing something slow and romantic, and Dante led her onto the dance floor. As they moved together, surrounded by family and friends who had accepted their love story despite its unconventional beginning, Sophia thought about the journey that had brought them here. A year ago, she had been a frightened woman working double shifts and looking over her shoulder, believing that safety was something she would never have again. Tonight, she was dancing at her engagement party with a man who would move heaven and earth to protect her, planning a future that felt limitless in its possibilities. The scared waitress who had frozen when her abusive ex walked into Luna's diner was gone, replaced by someone who knew her own worth and had claimed the love she deserved. As Dante spun her gently and pulled her close, Sophia caught sight of their reflection in the ballroom's mirrors. They looked like people who belonged together, who had found in each other exactly what they needed to become the best versions of themselves. "I love you," Dante murmured against her ear as the song ended. "Forever," she replied, meaning it with every fiber of her being. Looking around at the faces of people who had become her chosen family, working at a job that gave her purpose, engaged to a man who cherished and protected her, Sophia realized she had found something she hadn't even known she was searching for. Not just safety, not just love, but home in its truest sense. A place where she belonged completely, where she was valued for who she was, where she never had to be afraid again. Have you ever found that one person who makes you feel invincible, who turns your greatest fears into your strongest foundations? Sometimes the most unexpected love stories begin in moments of crisis, when someone brave enough to fight for you shows you what real protection looks like. Tonight, as Sophia danced in the arms of the man who had saved her life in every way possible, she knew that some endings are really just the beginning of everything beautiful.